You're listening to a podcast by Way Collective, a contemplative community for love and liberation in Santa Barbara, California. This recording was the conversation starter at our dinner and dialogue gathering on October 2nd, 2024. Thanks for tuning in. So for the past few weeks, we've been looking at what it looks like to ground ourselves in a compassion that is not only about feeling the feelings of others, which is empathy, but is also about providing a healing and restorative presence with one another in order to help us stay more connected to each other. And over the last couple of weeks, we talked about what that looks like to be those kinds of people who, so far as it depends on us, choose this way of connection in an era of punitiveness and political disgust. But what's been implied but not talked about in all of our conversations so far is the need to discuss what it looks like to establish healthy boundaries. So let me say here at the outset that what we're talking about when we talk about being compassionate and being a part of connection rather than fragmentation is explicitly not overextending ourselves to the point of hurt or burnout. It's not choosing love in such a way that we become vulnerable to those around us who might overstep our vulnerability in a spirit of accusation or argumentation. So what we're not talking about in this series is how to be a bleeding heart that sacrifices our own well-being for the sake of promoting some overall well-being. And what we have to learn into is how to promote what is within without, or to learn how what we cultivate internally can be brought healthily into the external world around us. Now, I'm so grateful that a friend of ours reminded us last week that this is different for different people. We all represent different intersectional identities, and each of us have different agency and power in the world. We each have a moral obligation to, again, without sacrificing an inner grounding, to be a force for healing and connection in so much as it is possible for us to do so. But some of us, because of our race, our class, our gender identity or sexual orientation, etc., don't have the privilege to extend ourselves in this way all the time. And it's important to be completely honest about that. So when we are talking about being compassionate people who are a part of healing or restoring our interconnectedness societally, we're not talking about making ourselves vulnerable to harm from someone who is not extending that compassion back our way. You know, there's this thing in philosophy and social sciences that we call power analysis, which means simply taking stock of our privilege or our agency in any given situation. And there was a philosopher a long time ago named Bertrand Russell who said that there are two forms of power that have many different expressions. The first form of power is the power of force or coercing another, which is pretty self-explanatory. And secondly, there's the power of psychological influence, like being socially conditioned to conform to certain norms, which is a little harder to see sometimes. Now, if you'll notice with me for a second, if you recall our Way Collective practices and values, we have this graphic where we say that we are moving from coercion to compassion. We're moving from conformity to creativity, which are the two forms of power named here. And it reminds me that early scholars said about Jesus that he was, quote unquote, self-emptying. And more specifically, this meant that he had emptied himself of forms of power. This is the way. And a later philosopher named Michel Foucault helped us also to see how the various powers in our society are interlocking, meaning there are various what he calls force relations that are influencing us at any moment. So for instance, if you are getting ready for work in the morning and you're deciding what you're going to wear that day, there are force relations tugging at us in many different directions. So there's the domination from above, which would be like the workplace's dress code and whatever laws our country have about attire or what can be worn or what can't. Then there's the opinions of our partners or spouses, our friends or our social groups, the opinions of our coworkers, or more generally, what's in fashion or what's cool or hip. And the point that Foucault makes is that there are multiple forces all operating at once, and they're all active in the same place, namely within you and me. So power analysis in any relationship, but especially in a difficult relationship, means taking stock. Does this person with whom I disagree have more force relations working in their favor and at their disposal to wield against me than I do? And again, this is also a taking into account how society has set things up, noticing who is in our society and has the most power, noticing in our society who has the least power, noticing who doesn't even have to work for power, and then who is being marginalized by the powers that be. It takes into account who has the power to raise their voice in the media and whose voices are not uplifted in the media. What races or classes or religions or gender identities or sexual orientations are we not hearing from? It takes into account relational dynamics. Who in this relationship that I'm in has a power dynamic? Is it a parent or an elder to a child in the family? Is it a spousal partnership, and who historically has had the power in that relationship? So it's from these types of questions that we get a sense of something very important. It's called our agency, which asks, how far do my actions and or influence actually extend? It's especially powerful to notice this in our relationships with difficult others, because it helps us to get a sense for what is actually possible in our continued connections with each other. And last week, we conceded that great phrase from that verse in Romans, so far as it depends on us. And this is so vital because it recognizes that agency is real and that it actually matters in interpersonal relationships because ours only goes so far. And peace is only as possible in a relationship so far as it depends on us. We are only in control of our actions and responses, not those of others, even though it would be nice if we could. And I believe that it's from this sense of our agency and getting a feel for the power dynamics that we can form healthy boundaries when needed. I remember when I was in a difficult time relationally with a close friend of mine who I had shared a lot of time and intimacy with, and we entered into some new uncharted territory as I was saying yes to my life's adventure and our values began to grow apart. Have any of you had this kind of experience with someone in your life? Yeah. Anyways, there was the obvious historic power dynamic in play in our relationship, which were, I think, in part sort of contributing to these new frustrations. And after an extended time of dispiritedness and argumentation and eventually distance, I eventually felt the desire to re-engage by getting or setting some new ground rules, if you will. And luckily at the time, I had really good mentors and advisors who helped me to get a sense for what was really going on within me and what really was the crux of the tension from my perspective, and to formulate what I felt needed to be said and name explicitly the lines I did not want crossed by this other person. And I can't tell you how empowering this journey was for me. It gave me a sense of my agency back that felt like it was hidden in the storm of our discontent. And it only took me, a couple of years to get up the courage to do it, right? Sometimes it takes time. And I'm so grateful that this person was actually receptive to these boundaries when I shared them. And they honored my need for apologies and committed with me to not cross lines that I had put in place for my own well-being and for the well-being of our relationship. And I recognize that this is not the case in every relationship, and that in some relationships, the only option left is estrangement, which is a sign of at least one person in the relationship respecting themselves enough to say, I will no longer take hurt or abuse from another, and the way that I can stay healthy is to set a boundary that means I have to leave. But also, what I learned through this experience was the truth of what a therapist had said to me that stuck with me ever since. Our boundaries are where our lives touch each other. Now, it makes sense that many of our first sort of knee-jerk responses to having to set a boundary is that what they really mean is separation. And on the surface, our initial reaction to boundaries is not that we're staying connected, likely, but that we are furthering the very fragmentation that we're trying to avoid in our divisive society. But listen to what one psychologist says about this. Boundaries are where true contact occurs. If I believe that you and I are identical, and I'm suffering too because you're suffering, then we can't really generate anything helpful in the relationship. But also, if your situation makes me back off completely, then that isn't helpful also. So if we can stay who we are and brush up against each other, then we have a working model for a real relationship. So I want to reflect with you all a bit on this definition of boundaries. Boundaries come in many forms, don't they? Boundaries could be interpreted as the physical walls of our homes or rooms. Boundaries could be the borders of our countries, states, or cities. Maybe you've encountered the boundary of your body moving through the world as you connect with other entities. We've got psychological boundaries we keep for ourselves, boundaries perhaps also from certain kinds of media intake, etc. But what if seeing boundaries as forces of separation is too small a way of thinking about them? What if healthy boundaries were not borders or walls, but something altogether more relational? And what if they have something to teach us? So what I want to suggest to us tonight is, what if we started to see boundaries as a necessary part of the nature of our interconnectedness and of our embodiment, or of our minds, and of our world? What if boundaries are there to protect us, not separate us? And what if they could help us learn how to move back toward life together in a more generous and connected way? It really is true, metaphysically speaking, that there's nothing that is really and fully separate from its surrounding world. And yet, it's important to note that each of us have our individual experiences of ourselves that are necessary for us to get in touch with in order to become or to better connect in harmony with the world around us. And with this essential facet of our being, of our boundaries kept intact, we can learn to be both courageous and connective, which is what it will take for us to stay connected while living with urgency and depth and justice in these times. So I love that the author Bayo Akomolafe has said, "The times are urgent, and so we must slow down." So setting healthy boundaries might take us slowing ourselves down enough to consider our power, to get in touch with our agency, and to discern what boundaries might be necessary for us to set. So tonight, I hope we can be mindful of these questions. What are we using our power for? Is it to empower others or exercise power over them? Is our agency being used to be authoritarian or to be authorial, encouraging others to write their own story, calling forth the best out of them, no matter their response? We might ask, what boundaries do I want to work on to strengthen my ability to be in relationship and keep connection with those whom I differ? Or what boundaries that I have up tend to lead me toward further separation or loneliness and isolation, rather than a stronger sense of my agency? And lastly, what healthy boundaries do I want to keep in my life so I can continue to be both courageous and connective in a time of fragmentation? If we have done our best in any given relationship to stay connected, and we've had to put up boundaries in order to protect ourselves and remain grounded, then we're doing our part to promote a healed and whole and interconnected world. So let's chat about this. Thanks for listening to this podcast by Way Collective. To keep up with our community, you can subscribe to this podcast, go to www.waycollective.org, or follow us on Instagram at @waycollective. Peace and every good, y'all.